Good afternoon and welcome to our intelligence briefing. I'd like to begin by sharing a quote that I recently came across. And here it is. I think you all agree that we're living in most interesting times. I never remember a time in which history was so full, in which day by day brought us new objects of interest, and let me also say, new objects for anxiety. That quote was by Joseph Chamberlain, a British statesman, and it was delivered in 1898. That phrase of living in interesting times has been used countless times throughout history by many people, including world leaders. And like it or not, today we continue to live in interesting times. Hi, I'm Joe McLaughlin, and again, welcome to Haverford Trust's Intelligence Briefing. I'm joined today by Benny Wittlisbach, our president. Together, we'll be moderating our discussion with Tom Ridge. We're both in our office today, socially distancing 6 feet apart, and our conversation today will involve national and international security, cybersecurity, and risk management. We won't be weighing in on the upcoming presidential election or the elections in Congress or in the Senate. We're going to save those conversations for another day, November 19th, when we're going to invite back Dan Clifton from Strategas, who'll be reviewing the results of the November 3rd election and his intake on the impact of those results on the economy and the capital markets. The fact that we live in interesting times today is a key reason for our hosting the intelligence briefings, as we have done for the last few years. We view you, our clients, as thought leaders in our community, and we enjoy bringing together you and expert speakers with important viewpoints and information. And we hope that in the next hour or so, you'll be better informed about issues concerning our country beyond the capital markets and the economy. Today, Benny and I are thrilled to introduce you to Tom Ridge. Tom is probably one of the most qualified individuals to speak on the subject of current national and international security. He calls it the new norm. Most of us know him as our twice elected governor of Pennsylvania from 1995 to 2001. And following the tragic events of September 11th, Tom became the first Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security. Tom was responsible for designing and implementing our nation's post-9/11 security response. Today, Tom serves as the CEO of his company, Ridge Global, that consults with corporations on matters of cybersecurity and risk management. And work takes him all over the world, but he remains very much a product of Pennsylvania. I can remember his leadership years ago. It was a combination of humility, decency, duty to our country, and strength. He was a calm face in our nation's response to terror, telling us all that we'll be okay and better as we put in place mechanisms for our safety, and most of those mechanisms are still in place today. Tom's going to begin by providing an overview of his thoughts on national and international security, and that will be followed by your questions. And we invite you to participate by asking questions through the online chat feature. If you look just below Tom's bio, there's an online chat feature. What you do is you insert your question and your name and just click the submit button. Governor Tom Ridge, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for so many years of service to our country and our Commonwealth.
Well, let me tell you, it's a great pleasure to join you, and I want to thank you for the invitation. I must also acknowledge that prior to your formal invitation, my good friends David and Connie Gerard DiCarlo asked if I'd make myself available to you to have this kind of conversation with you and your clients, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity. And that's what I hope we can accomplish today, a good conversation around many issues dealing primarily with the digital world. And when I suggested to you a topic, a title, I suggested new norm, and I forgot to suggest we put a question mark around it, by it. because it is a new norm. Certain things are going to remain the same and certain things are going to change. And I thought we could take a look at a variety of perspectives because of the impact of the coronavirus, the changing geopolitical structure, and obviously the dramatic reliance and interconnectivity of the global community on the internet. So I think, first of all, I just want to say to you and everyone else, this invitation has given me an opportunity to do some thinking about issues that I had thought about before, but really am reconsidering now. You know, I've got this small business. I do a lot of political work, nonprofit work, and I chair the National Organization on Disability, but I'm not traveling. And your folks, your audience isn't traveling and at all. And I got more time. And I've been spending a lot of time reading and perhaps even more importantly, thinking in anticipation of this conversation. So I thought I would narrow our discussion into 3 dimensions and then open it up to your audience. I don't know about you, but I'm a traditionalist, and we can't talk about a new norm unless we talk about the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has on all of us, personally, our family, our businesses. We can't talk about a new norm without talking about the impact on employers and employees. You know, I've got a couple of friends who oversee some fairly substantial businesses in the service industry. One has 5,000 people dealing with financial services. Another has several hundred dealing with insurance. They're all working from home. And I asked about productivity and efficiency. And much to their surprise, not to their chagrin, but their surprise, they said we're every bit as productive as we were when we moved into our regular routine, into our regular offices. I don't know if you're surprised. I'm a traditionalist. I would like to separate my work from my home, but the new norm in the world of employment is going to take this into consideration. People are becoming acclimated to working from home. I'm not one of those that would feel comfortable doing it all times in the future, but HR departments and corporate leaders are going to certainly have to consider this. But when you think about working from home, you're going to think about more technology, bringing more of your devices into the workplace. And the more connections that you have to your company, to your employment base, to personal information, to perhaps trade secrets, to whatever it is that you have in that warehouse of data in that company, in that business, your needs to make sure that that base of business is provided adequate digital protection as more and more devices are connected to that place of employment through your employees, through your supply chain group. So that in and of itself, the pandemic, technology has been a convenience. We're able to do a lot of things that heretofore we had thought about but really never had been tried. But now we know it can be done, but there has to be a caveat. With more and more devices connected to that company, to your personal information, to family information, the company's information, beware. Every connection to the internet is a potential vulnerability. So it's going to raise the level of importance of digital security and digital resiliency in companies large and small. One of the after effects of the pandemic. I, for one, I think we're certainly up to it, but I think companies and corporations are going to spend a lot more time not only worrying about having a chief technical officer, but a chief security officer to understand that the physical and the digital connect, and that's going to elevate the responsibilities within businesses and corporations to protect their business. The second impact, I think, the second dimension I'd like to share with you and take this conversation is in the geopolitical world. The new norm, question mark. We all remember Ronald Reagan, Berlin, tear down the wall. We remember the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But we've seen a resurgence, a new hyper-nationalist leader in Vladimir Putin. And we've seen him going relatively unimpeded into Crimea. We've seen him move into the eastern Ukraine. We've seen rhetorical condemnation from the United States and our allies in Europe and NATO, but no really covert action. Oh, some diplomatic and economic efforts, but you have an emerging Russian, not Soviet Union, but a Russian president who would like to cobble together as best he can some of the old Soviet Union. So are we in the new normal going back to that historic Cold War confrontation? Remains to be seen. But as I said before, I've been thinking about the world in terms of my children and my grandchildren. And just as I think about the connectivity into businesses because of the reliance on the digital world, I think about how the geopolitical world is going to look, particularly to my grandson and my kids as he grows up. The emergence of Russia and how we deal with that. But perhaps even more importantly, as I take a look at a new normal, is China. You know, one of the books that I've read during this pandemic, there's two I'd recommend to your audience. One is called The Splendid and the Vile. It's about Churchill in 40 and 41. The other is Destined for War. Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard, talks about how historically, ever since Athens went after Sparta, challenged Sparta, you've had these rising powers that challenge the hegemon. It's a very interesting thesis. And in his thesis, as he looked at 16 different circumstances internationally, obviously for over many, many years, 12 of the 16 resulted in war. Now, that's not to say we're even close to that kind of conflict now, but think of what China has done just in the past 20 years. Our relationship with China, it is a new norm. It is entirely different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Look what they've done in terms of their use of foreign aid and dollars into Africa and other continents. Look what they've done with the Silk Road. Look at the trade agreements they have throughout the region. Look what they've done in the South China Sea. Look what they've done as they build up their cyber core and their military. They have probably the second largest economy in the world. It's growing. Now, their per capita income is below international norms, but you have an emerging economy, a growing military, an ever expanding role within the world. So that's the new norm. So what is the new norm for the United States of America? Now, there are, I guess one of the challenges that I think we have as a country, as individuals and even as political leaders, at least in my judgment, is to recognize the interconnectedness and the interdependency of the world writ large. You know, one of the, I guess one of the conclusions, as painful as it is with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that heretofore in your world, you knew finance is global. Markets are global. Transportation's global. Disease is now global. And so have our historic connections in terms of our ability to influence events around the world in our best interest. Think about this for the moment. Post-World War II, the only hegemon, the largest economy, the strongest military was the United States of America. And with our allies in Europe and other democratic countries around the world, in time it included South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, but we were able to build a global trading system, an international economy, and we were able, with few exceptions, to provide a relatively peaceful, stable world. This was the role that America played. Now think about it for the time being. Do we as a country now, and that's just not politics, do we have the desire to play that role in the world today? Do we have the ability and the capability to influence events that are favorable to us? The question remains the same. Is it a new norm? Well, the new norm may be very well that the rest of the world cannot rely upon America's leadership. And frankly, even if we chose to lead, would the circumstances in the broader global community give us the opportunity to do so? Even if we had the desire, do we have the capability? It's interesting when people take a look at the challenges we've given to NATO and the European Union to invest more dollars in their own military, more dollars in their own defense. While we've done that, at the same time, we've also kind of turned away, not turned away, but when everybody starts talking about buying America, now you're talking about a traditional republic, I'm a big free trader. And I keep thinking in terms of this global economy that we help build, global markets that have, the benefit has inured to us more than anybody else. But is the new norm, are we going to withdraw from the very global market that we help build in a post-War II area? Are we going to withdraw from the multilateral agencies that help rebuild some of these economies? So you have the emerging changes in Russia, emerging leadership. You've got this hegemon in China. We know the relationship there is going to change. So what will the new norm be for the United States? It narrows down to two critical issues: desire, maybe three issues: desire, capability, and what will the other democratic nations do, and how will we together, given the emergence of a superpower like China in time, will we band together as democracies consistent with a value system that has held us together for literally decades in order to countervail the global impact of an emerging China? Russia is really still involved in the region, but let's make no mistake about it. Their presence in the Middle East has altered our relationship over there. So you put all that together and you say, what will the new norm be in the geopolitical world in the 21st century? I suspect countries will continue to look at us to provide some of that leadership, but I think it's also very, very clear that they will have to make some unilateral decisions inside their own countries to provide for their own defense and to work even more regional strategies that heretofore they had perhaps ignored and relied solely on the United States to back them up for geopolitical reasons. Then the third dimension of the new norm, and this is the one I think that's the most powerful, and it's a world in which we live in. It's about the risk management of the digital world in which we live in. The ubiquity of the internet is its strength, and the ubiquity of the internet is its weakness. There's a Chinese proverb that says, flies will visit no egg without a crack. Well, there are a lot of cracks in the egg of the internet. And by virtue of those cracks, we can see and readily anticipate in the new norm of the digital world, the technology have an enormous impact on how we do business. Think about this for a moment. Think about this on a personal level. And this is really, do you think that our reliance on technology, heretofore maybe a casual reliance, but here now almost a dependency during the pandemic, will change our relationships in business? More importantly, what will the ultimate impact on us as individuals? The more and more technology in this digital world, in a risk-managed digital world, because it dehumanizes us, we get further and further away from human interaction. Does it lead to any cognitive decay over a period of time? When we got the impact of AI, when you no longer need to even finish spelling a word, let alone complete your sentences, let alone do a lot of those things which will really stimulate thinking. So the impact of that this digital world on us is something that we're all going to have to figure out. But I'm thinking more in terms of the impact on the political world and on the economy writ large. These are risks that have to be managed because of that connectivity. Think about this for a moment. The Russians interfered in our 2016 election. There is no doubt they did. The bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee drew that conclusion for all of Americans to see. And there is no doubt that they'll be interfering in this election as well. Will they control machines and ballots? No, not really. The safest ballot in America is absentee, but that's immaterial. Between the bots they've got established and the ubiquity of the internet, there'll be plenty of illicit sources out there trying to change opinions, trying to drive outcomes one way or the other. That's a reality. That's the new norm in the political world. And think about the reality in the political world even further. I go back to the times that President Obama probably harnessed in his first term the single largest and most effective internet campaign that we had seen to that date. Frankly, the Republican Party was kind of caught on its heels. And based on that campaign, he ran, obviously, two very successful campaigns. But he and his team were the first group to realize the potential of the internet to get out their message, to attract volunteers and raise money. Then we move into President Trump. Not only is he using the internet, but some people like the tweets, some people don't care for the tweets. It's immaterial. He has taken advantage of this digital medium in order to get his message across, and to many of his supporters, happily across those from the more traditional media. And what's the impact of this digital norm, this internet, on political parties? I could offer, again, limited experience. The last election I ran was in the late 90s, but political parties are less and less significant in terms of getting out the votes. They're less and less significant in raising money. So the political impact is rather significant. Then there's the use of the internet and the digital world, and we think about the new norm. It's a fifth dimension of warfare. It's another dimension of warfare. I remember as a soldier in Vietnam back then, it was air, land, and sea. We talked about space, but the cyber world is the fifth dimension. And it's also it's embedded in economic warfare as well as the traditional warfare. I think your audience probably is aware of this, but let's be very, very clear. The Russians and the Chinese, but particularly the Chinese, have used it very effectively over the past decade or so, and they continue to build up their cyber core to literally steal intellectual property, to steal defense secrets. So much for the marketplace of ideas, so much for entrepreneurism, so much for capitalism. If they don't have to make the investment, if they don't have to nurture the entrepreneurship, if they don't have to nurture the new ideas and steal those ideas, we know they've done it, and they'll continue to do that. In the political world, we can sell every day that they've weaponized the internet, not political world, but in the economic world. Every single day, China and the Russians attack our infrastructure. And I don't mean a couple dozen times a day. If you asked any major company, I don't want to say this, but any financial services group, any utility group, any critical sector, energy, financial services, transportation, the like, thousands and thousands of times a day, you're going to get pinged. As I said before, when we're dealing in the digital world, you and I have watches. We all have watches. America is like the just-in-time world. Americans feel good about wearing a brush. Our enemies in the digital world, when it comes to the internet, we have watches, they have time. They're far more patient than we are. So if you're talking about risk management and you're talking about the digital world, and I want to conclude here in a moment, it's just the new norm means that this is embedded in our lives professionally, personally, corporately, and it is incumbent upon all of us who have served and will continue to serve to elevate an awareness to the risk attendant to the internet. Now, I'm a person who believes that the glass is always half full. I think we're going to learn some lessons from the pandemic, and we'll apply those lessons in a very positive way, because that's what Americans do. We're going to endure this tragedy, and we'll figure out what we did right, what we did wrong, regardless of political affiliation, and move on and take lessons applied and hopefully be better prepared, because now we know disease is global. In terms of the geopolitical world, we now know we're connected, perhaps in a very different way, not only through our digital connections to law enforcement intelligence around the world, but on a country-by-country basis. It's a new norm. Well, to a certain extent, it's a new norm, because I think other countries are going to have to alter their relationship and their expectations of us in the United States. But ultimately, I think the new norm, we get back to some of the same basic collaboration with other democracies, countries of same or similar values. And finally, in the Internet of Things, we all know it's a potential point of vulnerability, but we also know there's enormous promise in the era of big data. We know that companies can be more efficient and effective. Our employees, we've experienced, can be at least as effective, if not more effective. We can improve the quality of education. We can improve agriculture. We can improve the delivery of healthcare. More information is the basis for, in my judgment, not only a more resilient America, but a more efficient America and potentially a more prosperous America. And so while we concern ourselves with managing the risk of being connected in the internet area, I'm one, again, who said the glass is always half full. And with the lessons learned over the past few years, both geopolitical, personal, and corporate, I think in time, America will rise to the occasion and continue to be the leader both in the economy and in the political world. And I'm pleased to have this chance to share these thoughts with you and hopefully generated some discussion for the Q&A.
It certainly has. So thank you very much, Tom. I have a follow-up question. So as it relates to China and Russia and them targeting our election systems, our financial systems, and so on, I was wondering if you could discuss our cybersecurity capabilities against them. Like, is our government able to retain and attract the brightest and best coders and cyber intelligence people, or are most of them working in California for, you know, a tech company? And how are we actually poised to fight against these attacks?
Joe, you couldn't ask a more appropriate question, because it's an inquiry I think our business and political leaders ought to try to answer together. Now, remember in 2001 when I was privileged to come in and begin work in the White House, and in 2003 we built the Department of Homeland Security. And I look back in those days, it seems like yesterday, although we're almost talking 2 decades ago. The concern about that ubiquity of the internet, concern about it being a tool for geopolitical influence, a tool of foreign policy, a tool of disruption, as it were. Well, we did some red cells when we thought, well, if you combine a physical attack with a digital attack, how are we going to deal with that? Well, you know, fast forward 2 decades, and the threat is real. It grows every day. And one of the challenges I think we have in government is precisely the one you identified with your inquiry. There are a lot of good men and women with capabilities who work for government. But let's face it, if you're given an opportunity to work for an emerging company in Silicon Valley or any corporation because of the digital world, and they need quality, not only technical people, but security people, and you have an opportunity to go in terms of pay, compensation, et cetera, got a family, where are you going to go? I mean, there's a lot of good people who I know are working for government today. They could probably be doing far better for themselves professionally and for their families. But they're patriots. They're going to keep working there, but we're not going to retain them for as long as we want. So I would like to see in the next administration, whoever it is, to rethink this whole issue of pulling together the public and the private sector to specifically address that problem. And I, for one, believe that shared executive, shared talent, there are ways that I think we could bring the capability, the enormous capability of the private sector to government. And I'd like to think that one of the lessons learned, particularly over the past couple of years, is that this is a place, in spite of the reluctance of some of the Silicon Valley companies to work or collaborate, we know, on some of these issues with the government, it's our country's long-term best interest, and frankly, the technology community's best interest to figure out a way to collaborate in that fashion. It's a serious question. It's a serious deficit. And only, in my judgment, until we figure out a way to partner, we'll be able to reduce that deficit.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? Boy, that's an interesting question. Well, first of all, I'm always been bullish on America. So I think our ability to work through this, I think what keeps me up right now is wondering what I would be doing. Fair question. I've often wondered what I would have done in Pennsylvania as governor had I been given the responsibility to lead the state during the pandemic, and how I would have figured out how we could keep focus on, as my kids would say, multitask, both the pandemic and the health of my citizens, but at the same time, making sure that we didn't bring the economy to a screeching halt. And so trying to figure out what that blend, what that mixture should be between being health conscious and safety conscious, but at the same time worried about resiliency in our economy, and at least keeping the economy going so that the losses would be held to a minimal rather than catastrophic. And what keeps me up at night is the notion that, and I'm not casting aspersions or blaming anybody, I don't think we've found the right alchemy yet in how we can do that. So as I've stayed awake at night wondering what I would be doing as a governor, I thought a little bit about DHS, but not so much there. I do think about that in terms of responding to natural disasters, and I did think about the fires, I think about the flooding, you think about Hurricane Delta, but really leadership during the COVID is probably what makes me wonder what I might have done as governor. By the way, I would say this, only if I had my team around, the same team around me. You know, you're only as good as the people you have. I don't care whether you're running the Haverford Trust, whatever you do, you're only as good as the people you have around them. So I didn't want to be governor again without the people I had working with me and serving the Commonwealth when I had the privilege to serve.
Tom, you mentioned the two, big bad guys, China and Russia, but what countries are best at sharing intelligence with the United States?
You know, I would tell you that even though we may have at least rhetorical disputes between this country and our traditional allies, I'm absolutely convinced that the intelligence sharing capabilities, the law enforcement capabilities were still joined at the hip. And that was one of the consequences post 9/11. It probably accelerated those relationships. And I think during that period of time, built a greater sense of mutual trust and mutual reliance from an intelligence and law enforcement capability. So there's no doubt in my mind that we can argue about funding NATO and we can argue about trade, but those two critical elements, particularly among the democracies, I'm convinced are absolutely as firm as they've ever been, and it's in our mutual interest to preserve them that way, and I'm quite confident that they have been.
So, Tom, Bruce writes in and asks that many of us receive multiple fraudulent scamming emails, and they're getting smarter every day. What can we do on the private sector to protect ourselves, and should the government be doing anything more to protect us against these really smart scam artists?
Well, first of all, to date, it's my judgment that with the exception of the government coming out with what they call NIST standards, basically setting some borderline cybersecurity standards and hoping that the private sector and individuals will follow them, the government has really been much more punitive than helpful. I mean, we've seen that over time. And when I've had the opportunity to address this issue before the business community, not that you're in this by yourself, but I think for the time being, you're going to have to rely more on your common sense and your good judgment. And I think it starts with education and awareness. You know, one of the things I've done and in the process of doing or building out some interesting cyber education programs everywhere from boards of directors down to individual employees. So in answer to a very appropriate question, as the world becomes more and more dependent upon technology and more devices are hooked up to sources of information and knowledge, et cetera, that we don't necessarily want to share, education. And it's quite revealing that more often than not, there are more incursions into your network because of indifference, lackadaisical, minimal security standards than anything else. So I would just, whomever asked the question, I would just say to you, educate your CEOs. Phishing is still one of the more interesting ways. Look, if you get on the internet and it's too good to be true, it probably is. I mean, even in my shop, we have an external third-party source that helps monitor our networks. But I think the key to answer that question is education. Continuing education, continuing use of third-party ethical hackers, continuing upgrading your software security. It is not a static environment. It is a permanent threat, but the nature of the threat changes. And so your mindset toward prevention can't be static. It has to be dynamic as well.
We appreciate that. I know that at Haverford Trust, we work hard
Sure.
every day to try to keep against those threats and educate all of our employees to look out for them as well. So, Tom, another question from another Tom, who asks, in light of the recent attempt of the kidnapping and harm Governor Whitmer, how do you gauge the risk of similar events happening?
Years ago, when I was privileged to serve the president as Secretary of Homeland Security, and even before then, we used to have daily briefings, daily, mind you. And the president was in his office early on getting an intelligence briefing around with regard to, excuse me, events in countries around the world. And then Mueller, excuse me, then Mueller, Ashcroft, and Ridge would go in and brief the president on terrorism. And even back then, 15 years ago, from time to time, extreme domestic terrorism and terrorists, not associated with any jihad, not associated with any ideology, but frankly, back then and even today, was right-wing militia, the kind whose ugly head appeared during this event and circumstances around what occurred in Michigan. So the only thing I could tell you is this kind of threat is not new to the FBI. It is something they've been very vigilant for the past couple of decades. But in a report that was released in the past couple of days, I believe, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security identified it as the #1 terrorist threat. Not necessarily the jihadists right now, although we're keeping our eyes on them, obviously. Even the globe is, and our allies around the world are. But this kind of activity is viewed by a lot in the law enforcement community as the #1 terrorist threat in this country.
So the role of the TSA, is looking for such, tiny needles in haystacks that, of course, can make a massive difference, as we've all seen. What is the government doing in terms of trying to prevent and address the threats to our infrastructure, such as electricity, which, we can't run any of our internet or any of our other stuff without electricity, the water, the pipelines, et cetera?
During my time as a secretary, we divided the economy into multiple, what we call critical sectors, critical infrastructure. And at the top of the list, you can probably imagine, were the financial services industry, the energy industry, transportation, and the like. Over the past decade plus, what has transpired within these different industry groups is something called the Information Sharing Analysis Centers. They call them ISACs. And they are connected not only with law enforcement, but they have representatives from within their industry, from within corporations, to share information, precursors potentially to cyber attacks, any information related to potential attacks on their digital infrastructure. This is a capability that continues to expand and mature. Your audience should know that the earliest involvement and the most effective and earliest ISAC was in the financial services industry. It shouldn't be any surprise that the Fed and the financial services industry recognized that need even before 9/11, but right after 9/11, to focus on sharing that kind of information in the digital world. And so the biggest challenge that I think the ISACs have, and I think slowly but surely it's being overcome, is you've got this core group of companies in these sectors that can share information with one another. Historically, it was difficult to pull some of that information from government into the ISAC. Because as you can well imagine, if I'm in law enforcement sitting in the FBI, I want to capture the perpetrator. And then if the ISAC is aware and they make accommodations to prevent that perpetrator from acting, that may foil the investigation. Well, I think over the years, the relationship between the government and these ISACs has matured considerably. And we're in a much better position to having that kind of public-private partnership in the digital world that heretofore didn't exist. It's a dynamic environment. They need to continue to share information. And there's some laws on the book to make sure that they're not stepping on any antitrust. There are no antitrust violations in the sharing of that information. One could say that's almost like a mutual defense pact. Because it happens over here, we're going to need to know what happened to ensure that it doesn't happen in our place. So I think the audience should be comforted to know that it exists, gets better every day, and the relationship with the government continues to improve and mature.
Tom, you mentioned some of our top national vulnerabilities that are being discussed. Are there any that aren't being discussed that should be discussed?
I would say this in fairness to all the critical infrastructure sectors, and they're all moving in the right direction, and they've all made great progress. So no, I think in the digital world, given the complexity of our economy, the reliance on every aspect of our economy on these digital connections, that one, the information sharing advisory councils are well positioned to help manage the risk. You can't eliminate the risk. It's just about managing the risk. They're getting more information from the government, but it is still incumbent upon that individual business, that corporate leader, to ensure that they have the appropriate tools, including continuing education of the workforce. So I can't say that there's any being ignored, but I will say that in my experience, everyone that I've come in contact with, particularly in the private sector, is looking on a daily basis to improve the quality of both their detection as well as their ability to respond and recover. I guess that's one of the challenges that all these companies have. You build resiliency. I mean, one of the resiliency into your operation to prepare for that eventuality that maybe the measures you took weren't quite good enough, weren't quite ample enough. But I'm pretty comfortable to saying to your audience that most of the private sector is really focused on this. At least in my experience interacting with I only have a small shop, I can't speak to a large universe, but most of the companies I'm working with got their eyes on, they're paying close attention to the digital world and managing that risk rather effectively.
So in today's paper in the Wall Street Journal, Microsoft is being engaged by the United States government to fight the Russian bot infiltration. What's your thoughts on this? And there's a good example, I think, of public and private coming together to fight the bad guys.
Well, I didn't read the journal yet. I'll get to it. Perfect. I don't know the extent that they're talking about, and I understand everyone's concerns about privacy. I understand where Silicon Valley where their reluctance to collaborate with the government has been historically. I get it. I understand it. But I say to these leaders of these companies, you have amassed enormous wealth for yourself and your shareholders. You have built an infrastructure that is the envy of the world. It's being mimicked. And you've frankly led the world in this incredible digital transformation. But the only place you could have built your business and built that infrastructure and become a global leader is in the United States of America, that has protected you because of the nature of our free enterprise system, that has protected you as best we can from foreign interference and theft of those secrets. So it's not about being a patriot, although that's a good place to start. It's about protecting the very infrastructure in the country that made it possible for you to build that infrastructure, to create wealth, to create jobs, and to contribute to a digital economy that is still the envy of the world. So I'd like to hear about these potential relationships. Both sides will be guarded, have to be respectful of one another. But I'd just like to remind, I'm not going to repeat myself, there's no other country that any of these companies could have flourished from beginning to where they are now other than the United States of America. So let's figure out how a way we can work together to protect those freedoms, protect that marketplace, and protect our sense of capitalism.
Love that answer. Thank you. So, Tom, which country do you respect the most in terms of the way that they are dealing and handling the cybersecurity and safety?
I don't have enough of a universe of comparisons to give you. The only observation I would make is that in my limited travels in different parts of the world, there is no country that is paying more attention, that is expending more capital, and whose private sector is as focused on protecting their assets from digital incursion in the United States of America. There may be lessons learned from other countries, but writ large, I mean, some countries are just becoming aware. That's not fair. I'm just going to conclude, in my limited experience, not so limited, no country is working harder at it than us, and no private sector is more focused at it than ours.
So China, Russia, Iran are attacking us with cyber attacks. What kind of job are we doing in attacking them?
Well, let me see if I answer this question appropriately, because it's a very good question. Very good question. Let's go back to when we used the digital access we have to Iran's nuclear buildup to wreak some havoc in their nuclear infrastructure, maybe well over a decade ago. So we've used offensive digital action as an instrument of foreign policy. We know we've used it. It should only, but we also know that the three countries that you've identified are hacking into us, into our infrastructure, into our private, every single day. I can only imagine or suspect that the offensive capability that we have, and I'm quite confident that we have it, will be deployed when the powers that be believe it's necessary to send that message as a matter of deterrence. You know, it's a very interesting question that you raise, because one of the challenges in the 21st century, and as we figure out what the new norm is, we now have the sophistication, we can pretty much attribute where the attacks come from. Not perfectly, but we're pretty good at it. But the gap between attribution and accountability, that's different. And how our military and how our public leaders breach that gap, and when they breach that gap, I can't tell you when or if it's been done. I'm pretty confident we have that capability. I, for one, when Kim Jong-un was, sending some of his missiles across our allies, South Korea and Japan and the like, I don't know if it happened, but I would have loved, because I suspect we can tap into his system, I would have loved for him to tap on his iPad or his desktop and see the American flag waving across his screen, and maybe the Star-Spangled Banner being played behind it, just to let him know we've got access, so knock it off. So I don't know. I'm pretty confident we got the capability, but neither one of us are going to know if and when it's been used. But remember, there's a gap between attribution and accountability. How we fill it and when we fill it and when we use that capability is of strategic importance to this country. And you never want that kind of to escalate into a digital war. But I feel pretty confident that some of our enemies know we've got the capability.
Yeah.
Great. We just have a couple minutes left, so we'll have one more question. And Ned wants to know, what do you believe is our biggest domestic threat?
Real quick to answer your previous question, remember we have a U.S. Cyber Command. We have very specific within a Cyber Command, so just remember that as you're thinking about attribution and accountability. Biggest domestic threat, I will say, I think we'll handle the this militia violence on either side, right-wing militia or violence promoted by any of the left-wing organizations. That's unacceptable. I think we have the capability of handling it. I think the biggest threat right now is figuring out a way. I don't see it's a threat. The biggest challenge is getting our economy back. Getting it back in motion. I mean, I'm glad the market's doing well. I'm glad that those who've invested have really endured all this anxiety. But there's a lot of people out there struggling. There's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that if they're not on life support, they're damn near close, and some have actually expired. So I think the single greatest threat or challenge we have going forward in this country is our ability to deal with the pandemic and our ability to deal with recovery, because at the end, our strength in our economy, our values are important to us, our legacy important, but you can't be a strong country without a strong economy. And I think we all understand that, and I think that's the biggest challenge. I don't view it as a threat that's insurmountable. I think it's a challenge that's going to take us time, but to achieve. We're resilient, we're tough, we're smart, we'll get our way through this. I'm confident of that. But I think that's the biggest challenge.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. And we really appreciate your comments. And I love how you're so positive and upbeat and that the glass is half full.
It's always
That's
half full.
exactly how we look
You
at
live
it,
in America.
You live in America.
America.
You got to be bullish. You got to be long-term focused. And we certainly are. And I hope that all of you who joined us this afternoon enjoyed the presentation as much as I certainly did. And Tom, again, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to spend this time with you. So if you want to know more about Haverford, we ask that you come to our website. And if you want to know anything about the economy, markets, stocks, please visit our website and view some of our educational vignettes that are on there, because we've produced a lot of really good materials. Also, secondly, tomorrow you'll be receiving an email from us. We really appreciate it if you take the time to answer our questions, because we want to make sure that we continue to bring you programs that are meaningful to you. And then thirdly, look out for November 19th. As Joe had mentioned earlier, we will be happy to host Dan Clifton, who will be talking about politics and the economy and what the shape of everything looks like now that the election will then be done. And then finally, on December 1st, we're hosting an event on education for nonprofit institutions. So if you need to know anything more, want any more information, again, please visit us at haverfordquality.com. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.